Metamorphosis is a wonderful word. In biology, it describes a process of transformation in form from infancy to the adult stage in the life history of an organism. It can be a period of profound and abrupt change. Two words come to mind: putate, mutate.
Inside the acorn, there isn't an oak tree, but given the right climate, given the right environment, it can grow and become a majestic, enormous tree that can last for hundreds and hundreds of years.
In 2007, we made a journey to the German city of Kassel with the sole intention of collecting acorns from an artwork called 7,000 Oaks. This was planted by Joseph Beuys, widely regarded as one of the most important and influential artists of the 20th century.
One of the founder members of the German Green Party.
Between 1982 and 1986, Beuys planted 7,000 trees, no mean achievement, and famously called for all cities and towns to become forest-like.
We now have about 200 of these saplings growing. We've exhibited them throughout England, including the Royal Academy in London. And last year we took 100 of them on a 6-city tour of France. We exhibited in contemporary art galleries, botanic gardens, libraries, museums, and finally in the King's Garden at the Palace of Versailles. In each city we gifted one tree, and this is the Versailles oak being planted with help from students from the École des Beaux-Arts, and it's in the Paupers Cemetery in Versailles.
Beuys's Acorns Trees on Tour culminated in this major new artwork in front of the Parisian Natural History Museum in the Jardin des Plantes, the Botanic Gardens. And this coincided with Paris holding COP21, the United Nations gathering of all parties for the Conference on Climate Change, an incredibly historical and important event. And here we are, we created a stage and we presented a 6-meter evergreen oak with these beautiful drapes of living grass. And we were framing the tree as an actor in an urban drama of rising temperatures in cities, the so-called urban heat island effect. Now, scientists have shown that during a heat wave, cities are on average 4 degrees centigrade hotter than the surrounding countryside. And recent scientific modelling has shown that adding 10% of trees to cities can reduce temperatures by 4 degrees centigrade, effectively climate-proofing the city until 2080. Paris also set the stage for a historic, global, universally binding deal on carbon. It has now been ratified by 86 countries, and on November the 4th, the Paris Agreement comes into force.
Here we have the brutalist building of the National Theatre on the South Bank in London. We literally grew the fly tower of the theatre, covering it by hand with a thin layer of clay, pushing seed into it and watering it. The clay, if it dries, would crack and fall off, so it was quite a risk. Water was all important. We actually sourced a ground source of water that was being pumped out of their underground car parks. We had it analysed, and it was perfectly fine for watering the grass. We installed a pump, pumped it up into the building, and that water is now being used throughout the National Theatre through their grey water system. So their toilets, their washing machines, everything is run from that, saving them thousands of pounds.
The United Nations says that adaptation to climate change primarily now depends on what happens in urban centres, and this is because mankind has passed a threshold. Globally, there are more people now living in cities, in the urban space, than in the countryside. So we are calling, and have been calling for many years, through this artwork, through Beuys's Acorns, for a planting revolution, a radical transformation, to evolve our cities over the 21st century to combat the worst that climate change can throw at us.
Our eyes are specifically tuned to the colour green. Early Homo sapiens, the retina, the rods and cones in our eyes, can seek out that colour. The green was where life was, where the water was, and it became a fundamental way that we've developed. The chlorophyll molecule is exactly the same as the heme molecule that we have in our blood. The only difference being that in chlorophyll we have magnesium at the centre, and in the heme in our blood we have iron that gives it the red colour.
We made a chance discovery that by using this exquisite molecule of chlorophyll, we could make these large living photographs. Seedling grass grown on a wall in the dark, we project a negative. Where the light falls, the chlorophyll produces the green pigment. Where there's no light, the grass still grows, but it's bright yellow. So we get this extraordinary complex photograph in all of these tones, from yellow through to green. And the image is actually inhabiting on a molecular level. And chlorophyll is also responsible for kickstarting this very profoundly important process of photosynthesis.
Without photosynthesis, we wouldn't have life on this planet as we know it. The fact that the word actually, it means constructing, building with light. And the fact that the plants can take the energy from the sun, transform it into starches, into sugars, and into oxygen, has given us the atmosphere that we breathe. It's given us all the plants we eat, all the plants that animals eat, and it's also given us fossil fuels.
In 2003, we created this piece of work. It was 13 years in the making. This was a deconsecrated concrete church in Bermondsey Park, Dilston Grove. And we brought in our raw materials, which is really messy: clay, seed, water, and light. But they're life-enhancing, the stuff of creation myth. And in this disused space, we created this sort of temporal vegetable resurrection. And it was a profoundly affecting space to be in. We'd watch people sitting there at times for hours. It is very, very calming. But also underneath this calming space, we were provoking and asking questions about religious empiricism, about dictates that have been given over centuries, millennia, that man has dominion over nature.
Tigers have been on this planet for 2 million years, and in the last decade we've eradicated 95% of them. This work we grew in 1992 for an exhibition at the Serpentine Gallery in London, and we've regrown it since then, exhibiting it in different formats. But it's one of those things, I think the living skin, instead of a stretched out dead skin, is something that we really wanted to show instead of the blood and the...
Poaching, illegal logging, cutting down trees for timber for paper, extensive palm oil plantations across Sumatra, urbanization, building roads. These are all pressures that are being put onto these wild species. And we have to add in to this climate change. And the toxic mix is now overwhelming, and many species are being pushed to the brink. And this includes the polar bear, the iconic creature, the poster creature for climate change in the high Arctic. In 2008, it was put under protection for the Endangered Species Act. Scientists were showing that the sea ice in the Arctic is dwindling, it's disappearing fast, and this is threatening the habitat and the feeding and the breeding habits of the polar bear. We've been really fortunate over the last few years to make a series of expeditions up to the high Arctic with a really fantastic organisation called Cape Farewell that draws artists and scientists and educationalists together to creatively face the conundrum that is climate change and come up with creative solutions. So we had this idea, Dan and I had this idea, that we could grow a diamond out of a polar bear bone.
In 2007, with the right paperwork, we were given a polar bear bone. We brought it back to the UK. We placed it on the barbecue and cremated it and reduced it to ashes.
The ashes were sent off to a company in Chicago in America who extracted the graphite out of the graphite. Over a matter of weeks, they grew a diamond. Now, this is where we are now in the 20th and 21st century. We have these technologies that can do what nature does in millions, if not billions of years, under immense pressure and intense heat. And diamonds are the hardest substance known to nature, 99.9% carbon. And our diamond is tiny. You could walk past this case and miss it, and we did often see people do that. But if the light struck it in a certain way, you'd be drawn up to it. And there was this twinkling diamond, very, very exquisite, but it carries this inherent pathos about it. It talks about, how scarcity increases value, and it poses a question for us: what price is being paid for carbon?
On another one of the expeditions to Svalbard, we came across beaches where wherever you dug down in the snow, you would come across whale skeletons, whale bones. And we realized to the extent that the whale had been exploited for its oil, that it was whale oil that probably kick-started the Industrial Revolution. And now we found another form of oil, and we're exploiting that. And so What is happening is that the oceans are becoming more and more acidic because of the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. This is affecting all life in the seas, but especially the plankton, the staple diet of whales. So when we returned from this voyage, we wanted to get hold of a whale skeleton and produce a piece of work. We were lucky enough, with permissions through the Natural History Museum and their cetacean stranding program, to come across the carcass of a whale washed up in Skegness. We brought together a small team and we spent 3 days on the beach cutting it up. It was a juvenile whale, not too large, luckily. For a lifelong vegetarian, I tell you, it was not the most pleasant of jobs. I think it got worse when we actually got back to the studio.
Yeah.
We numbered all the bones. We took them back to a barn space not far from here. We boiled them up and we cut off the remaining flesh. We put them through a process of cleaning with enzymes because the whale bones have an awful lot of oil in them. And in the end, we ended up with an ivory-coloured, beautiful, clean skeleton. But then we subverted that. We put it through supersaturated solutions and literally encrusted the bones with crystals. And this piece has been displayed internationally now.
We corrupted it. In one sense, we corrupted it, which is, what we are doing to our oceans. We showed this piece most recently for the launch of the opening of the pioneering David Attenborough Building at the University of Cambridge. The minke whale skeleton is about 6 meters long, and we always show the film that you've just seen, a short minute of. It's actually 17 minutes, along with the piece, because we want to show people the process that is involved within this. And here you can see a close-up of the diamonds. But for the last 3 years, we've been working on a public art commission with the University of Cambridge, specifically working with the Cambridge Conservation Initiative and the Department of Museum of Zoology. And in addition to these works we showed in the Tempe exhibition, we created 2 exterior permanent artworks as well.
This is an architectural wall. It's made up out of thousands and thousands of pieces of slate that are a waste product from the roofing industry. In the wall, we've set behind the slates probably about 3,000 little snail shells, which are ideal homes for spiders or solitary bees. And above, we have an area where bats can roost, so it is actually a habitat wall, a living wall.
We also created a series of artworks for a temporary exhibition inside the David Attenborough Building. So just behind Stranded, it looks like a large blank canvas, 7 meters wide by 3 meters high, but actually when you got up close, there was very, very faintly printed the names of 4,734 species. All of these species are critically endangered. And we drew the information from a wonderful resource, which is from the International Union for Conservation of Nature Red List. It's been going for over 50 years. It's really, really incredible. And we invited the audience to participate. So they could come in, look at the wall, and they would say, ooh, what is that species? That really interests me. And we would give them a pair of white gloves and a red pen for the Latin and a black pen if there was a common name. And they would overwrite the species. And what it did was it drew these names, which are lost, which are hidden, which none of us really know, to the surface. So you can see the names of some of these creatures, which are exquisite. And day by day, week by week, more and more was brought to visibility.
It's probably a name that everybody knows, David Attenborough, writing over the Attenborough pitcher plant. There's something about this wall. I think a list like that, it's quite hard to gauge, and in fact it's probably realistically 2 or 3 times longer. There are a lot of data deficient species, but it's a bit like a war memorial, and yet each name is not a single individual, it's an entire species.
But we actually never found ourselves to be downcast when we were working on this piece, or even working amongst these conservationists and academics and researchers. Because what's happening at this building is truly, a metamorphosis about how science and research is done. It's fantastic. It's a language of collaboration, and it has an outreach to over 180 countries with people working in the ground, in the bush, with the oceans, with these animals. And there are conservation wins happening. You've probably heard recently that the numbers of tigers is now increasing in the wild, and this is because of the dedicated work that's being done. Giant pandas are increasing, and there's many, many species that none of us are familiar with, but their habitats are being restored, and these creatures are surviving because of this level of conservation.
There are probably more conservationists now walking the planet than there ever have been. This work was created nearly 20 years ago. We were working on a landscape course. The lake was flooding. It's in Sweden. But the level of severe weather events that is happening is always increasing. This year, Paris flooded with the Seine overflowing its banks. London breached and flooded the home counties.
Vast swathes of China, a huge country, were flooded and continue to be flooded now. I regularly go on to flood watch. Andalusia in Spain is suffering severe weather and flooding. 13,000 families need humanitarian aid in Colombia. We don't hear about these on the news, but they're all happening. And it just brings up a lot of questions about how we're going to go forward. How are we going to deal with this in the 21st century? The Paris Agreement is throwing humanity and multi-species a huge lifeline. And it's going to take huge political will to make this work. And I have to be honest here and say it doesn't engender a lot of belief when post-referendum, the newly assembled government, the first thing they do is to dismantle the Department of Energy and Climate Change and actually overthrow local councils who have said we don't want fracking. They say, no, you are going to have fracking.
Charles Darwin, who wrote in the last years of his life the book The Formation of Vegetable Mould Through the Action of Earthworms, those experiments actually happened very close to here on Leith Hill, where his sister lived. And Leith Hill, an area of special scientific interest, an area of outstanding beauty, is now under threat through permission being granted for exploratory oil drilling on that hill. I don't think anyone needs a crystal ball to see that we're actually turning this world upside down.
We sometimes describe that we're between a rock and a melting place. But, you know, we're not going to get defeated or depressed by what's going on. We're going to carry on working. We're going to carry on doing what we do best, which is making art. And we're going to nurture the relationships that we've set up over the last 26 years locally. People here, nationally and internationally. We're going to throw our energy into making our art, and we're going to continue our activism. Thank you.
Thank you.